farm workers is a segment of the working class that remains most vulnerable. Join us in this week's show as we take a look at COIDA and whether it is responsive to ameliorate some of these working conditions, but to also provide respite for when injury and disease is particularly generated in the workplace. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress.
Welcome to our Workers' World show. I'm your host, Shirik Trubani. Thank you once again for having joined us. We've been running a series of programming looking at COIDA, a piece of legislation that is meant to respond to instances where workers either get injured or contract disease in the workplace. And today we particularly focus on agriculture and farm workers that have been at the heart of South Africa's economy for centuries. The food that farm workers produce is quite essential for life, yet the conditions of employment for thousands of farm workers remain harsh and reminiscent of the cruel era of slave labor as well as the racist apartheid conditions. Now, during the apartheid era, farm workers were excluded from legal protection pertaining to their labor rights. This changed after 1994. But to what extent has it improved their lot? In this week's show, we learned a little bit more about the legislation called COIDA and its impact certainly for farm workers and their employment. But first, let's now go to our insert prepared for us by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
Ons is nou 9de jaar hier wat ons hier bly by plaas. En elke jaar is dit mos nou spuittyd. Dan moet die wingerd mos nou gif kry as die oes klaar is. Nou my man het gespuit. Hulle het mos die spuitkanne en die trekkers wat spuit. As die wind waai, hulle spuit al aan. Hy kyk as jy mos nou spuit en die wind waai, hy gif in jou gesig. En met die gevolg het my man vir die hele 8 jaar het hy al die gif so ingeasem. En hy het net begin opgooi met sy klomp wat skyn wat hy opgooi. Hy het baie gelei. En hy het baie min gewerk want hy kan nie, want hy is net by die werk kom en gooi op, dan bring hulle hom huis toe. En so is my man toe Worcester Hospitaal toe. En toe hy nou die kameraatjie sluk, toe sien hulle in sy mag. Nou sy mag was so goudgeel stuk, soos goudgeel vet, so geel laag het was op sy mag. Nou sê die dokter vir my, is iets groots fout met die mag. En het was net 'n week daarna toe bel die dokter toe sê, hy moet aankom vir operasie. Hulle moet die mag verwyder. Maar toe sê die dokter vir my, hulle wil vasstel wat die kanker veroorsaak, maar die mag het hulle wegstuur. Dat hulle hele mag van hom weggestuur. En is baie swak, en toe sê ek saam met hom hospitaal toe, maar hulle kan my nou niks eindig vir hom toe maar nog gedoen het. En was die 12de Mei het hy toe afgesterwe. Toe sê die dokter, mevrou, wat se werk het meneer Piet spesifiek gedoen? Toe sê ek, hy het plaaswerk gedoen, hy het gewerk met die gif, het gespuit met die gif elke jaar. Die dokter het vir my gesê dat hy is nie dood van kanker het. Dit is van hy gif wat hy ingeasem wat al die jare so opgepak het. Die ander man sê, hy is 'n stuk van 6 mense al so dood van die gif. Daar kom niks af aan nie.
So we commissioned desktop research which found that 67 of the pesticides that are currently used in South Africa are already banned in the European Union, and for a good reason. They are dangerous and detrimental to human health. We are saying that pesticides that are banned in the European Union need to be banned in South Africa. South African workers' lives have the same value of farm workers in the global north.
Daar is nie toilets in die wingerde nie. En nou sê in moet geval jy meneer gaan sit en pee. Daar is nie toilets nie. Dan moet jy maar opsit. Ons is vroumense. Jy moet jou hele liggaam opmaak om te sit. Waarom toe baie hy gifstowwe nie? Hulle nou gespuit het nie in jou liggaam. Dit is papier om jou reg skoon te maak nie. Ek is allemaal my wingerd, my rok se soem op so gevat, dan moet ek maar so vie. My rok se soem is klaar vol gifstowwe. En ek het pyn gehad. Hy was 'n vreedpyn geweest binne my in. Daar het ek uitgevind. Hierdie gifstowwe het hierdie kanker veroorsaak.
Part of what we've been doing in partnership with Department of Labour is to do COIDA and OHS workshops. That's Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act and Occupational Health and Safety. In most of the farms that we've visited so long, in the Karoo, Klein Karoo, places like your Central Karoo, Laingsburg, Liachamka, Oudtshoorn and elsewhere, we found out that people still don't know about the Act and they are receiving the information in good faith. Then actually they are excited to know that there's such information and they want to interact more with our workers' world, the Department of Labour. They've also stressed out that in some cases they are not even getting the help that should be, that they should get at the Department of Labour, mainly because of capacity issues, maybe operational hours, and also the fact that they need to move out of the farm into Department of Labour. So these are some of the issues or challenges that they are faced with. But the excitement is there that we should visit them even more to tell them more about occupational health and safety and COIDA.
All right, so as we've seen there in the insert, the living and working conditions of farm workers. In this week's show, we want to understand whether there's this legislation that can respond to instances when they may find themselves in injury or diseased. That and more after the break. Do stay with us. All right, welcome back. Thanks very much for having joined us. As you would have seen there in that insert before the break, we dealt with the issue around the conditions that farm workers are afflicted with, and the type of recourse available to them is going to be our conversation for the next couple of minutes. We have, of course, Wendy Pakir that joins us. She is the founder of the Ubuntu Rural Women. Also with us, Daniel Samuel from the Labour Rights Program Coordinator on Women on Farms project. We welcome Professor Leslie London from the University of Cape Town, serving in public health medicine, as well as being from the public health movement. Thank you very much for having joined us. I want to start off with you, Professor Leslie. We have established in a previous program the basic principles of what COIDA is meant to do. And before we get into how it could potentially be responsive to the conditions of farm workers, could you maybe just give us an overarching sense of the conditions that farm workers have to endure?
Well, agricultural work is a hazardous job. In fact, it's one of the most hazardous jobs globally, and that's recognized by the International Labour Office, agriculture, fishing particularly. And part of the reason why it's so hazardous is not only because it's outdoor work and it's physical work, you're working with machinery, but it's also you're working with chemicals. And farm workers, in commercial farming at least, are exposed to a wide range of pesticides and other kinds of chemicals which might be hazardous to their health, both in the short and the long term. So there are many hazards they have to cope with in that way.
All right, what would you say, Daniel, are the typical injuries or exposures, the risks that agricultural farm workers are exposed to?
Yeah, just yesterday, we went to a farm to consult with a female worker who are affected with pesticides. They were spraying, and the rash on her body was so bad, it was itchy. The farmer refused to take her for medical attention. And that is just but one point in case. I mean, there are, especially during harvesting time, you'll find women and farm workers being infected and affected by the spraying of pesticides. And a lot of these incidents are reported to either the supervisor or to the management, but they really don't care. They don't, you know, take workers for medical attention where they could be assisted, where they could, I mean, register these kind of incidents. And especially when it comes to diseases. I mean, injuries on duties is something that you could really see. It's so physical when farm workers are infected or affected by chemicals. So workers who are injured, it's very difficult to deny them access to medical attention. Whereas
And I want to pick up on
workers
that,
who
and I
are
want to go to
infected,
Wendy just in a little bit. I want to come back to Professor Leslie very quickly, because you've done some research into the use of pesticides. Now, of course, when we think about the risks and the working conditions of farm workers, we often think about, you know, the long hours, the conditions under which they have to work, whether they have the proper resources and equipment, and we'll get into all of that during the course of our program here today. I want to just quickly deal with the issue around the pesticides, because as Daniel mentioned, there was just a case very recently where a farm worker had been exposed, a rash had developed, and the farmer did not quite want to even take the worker to the hospital to seek medical attention. Can you give us a sense of what these pesticides are? Are they harmful, and in what way are they usually used?
So there are many different kinds of pesticides, and a rash would be one of the many different kinds of problems that arise. Quite often, pesticides might be allergenic, in other words, they trigger an allergy, so you might get eczema, or they might be irritant, so they cause a eczema that's due to irritation. And rash is a very common side effect. It might be a signal that the worker has been exposed in ways that might affect other organs in the body, because if you absorb the pesticide into your body, it can affect, you know, your liver, your kidneys, and other ways. And those kinds of pesticides cause problems which are long-term. We call them chronic. Sometimes a pesticide can cause a short-term effect, like a rash or a reaction, and they recover from that. But all of that is work-related. So if you have a work-related injury, whether it's an illness or a physical injury, you're entitled to get treatment. And it's workers' rights to have access to occupational health services. The UN has a special system called a special rapporteur. These are experts in human rights. And they've brought out a report about the importance of occupational health services. Access to occupational health services is a right. As we know in South Africa on farms, there's very little access to occupational health services because it's all private, and the state doesn't provide that. So workers have to rely on the public service to do that, and we know how difficult that is for workers.
Okay, and I want to come back to how regular and infrequent use these pesticides are, and the measures that either are being put in place or not from perhaps the Agricultural Department. I'll come back to that in a little bit. Let's welcome Wendy. Wendy, of course, the founder of Ubuntu Rural Women. Wendy, how vulnerable, or which segment of farm workers are most vulnerable to occupational disease and injury in the workplace?
Yeah, good morning and thank you so much. Women are really harshly impacted. If we just look at how the spraying happened in the orchards and the vineyards, I mean, there's a problem with protective clothing, and that includes those spraying the pesticides, but the women are working in the orchard and vineyards, and they have no access to protective clothing. Sometimes they're just told to leave the orchard where they're working in, and then the spraying is done, and then they must continue working. So that leaves them vulnerable because they're exposed to the spraying, and you know, pesticides are also airborne, so it travels very far. The women go home with their gear. They must go wash it at home. They do the cooking and the food, the clothing, the pesticides clothing go home. Often if men are spraying, they also come home. The women must do the clothing, wash the pesticides clothing. And that brings some of these diseases also to the house, to the household. So the worker is affected, but also the dweller is not working necessarily in the orchard or the vineyard. They are also infected. If we look at the issue of toilets in the orchards and vineyards, I mean, the occupational health and safety act says there should be a toilet in the orchard in the vineyard. But we find this, in many cases, many years ago, we had a toilet campaign, just researching to see what is happening on farm. Because women have to go to the nearest bush to release themselves. And that's problematic because there is no dignity in that. The women go, and then pesticides are sprayed there. There's also rashes. I've heard many stories of women getting rashes on all parts of their bodies because of not having access to a toilet facility.
Yeah.
Toilets maybe come when audits are done, or WETA come, or audit companies comes out, and then the toilet is there, but it's not there throughout the year when the women are working in the vineyards as well. So there's a particular impact on the woman that works, and that seasonal work, 60% temporary, jobs in agriculture, 2/3 are held by women. So the job is precarious. Women don't speak out often because they're too afraid they're going to lose their job. If they speak out not wanting to work while pesticides are sprayed, they stand the risk of not getting employment again.
Yeah,
And that puts them in a particular vulnerable
I just want to pause you at
position
that point
because
because
they
I want to
yeah.
keep track on some of these conditions that, of course, farm workers are afflicted with. And of course, we do apologize there for some of the image quality of Wendy's frame. Of course, the weather has not been great in the recent times, so we do apologize certainly for that. But I want to quickly just not lose this point to go to Professor Leslie again. Are these pesticides generally harmful in the immediate handling of them, including to the type of produce that is being farmed?
So all pesticides are harmful in the sense that they try and kill something. They kill a bug, an insect, a weed. So they're designed to damage something biological. They're not designed to damage humans, but they do, because that's a side effect. Almost, it's not intended, but it happens. And some of them are more toxic than others. So the big problem with pesticides is that most of them are absorbed through your skin. So if you come into contact with the pesticide, you will absorb a little bit. And if you come into contact with a lot of pesticide, you will absorb a lot. So I'm not surprised that, Wendy describes the problem that if you have to go into the bush, you're basically going into these trees and there are bushes and it's been sprayed.
Yeah.
So you're coming into contact with the pesticide.
Yeah, I'm going to ask, Prof, sorry to check, I'm going to ask you just to pause there. I thought I have to go to a break. But once I want to return from the break, what happens after the exposure? What are the long-term impacts and effects? We'll get into that and more after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We are talking about the conditions under which farm workers have to work, but also whether legislation, as we've been running a series on COIDA, we'll get into all of that in a little bit, a reminder about the ability here of workers to seek recourse. But we are trying to understand the conditions under which farm workers have to work, and we've been talking a little bit about the conditions that usually involve transport, living conditions, working materials. But in this instance, we've been reflecting on the exposure to pesticides, for instance, because under COIDA there is a particular provision that allows for exposure to disease, to being injured at work, and of course all the other associated injuries that can be, of course, met on working in farms in particular. Professor Leslie, I want to just pick up on the question that we've just landed on before the break, and that is, after there is the exposure and the rash breaks out, are there usually long-term impacts with this exposure and the usage of pesticides?
Well, I can't say usually, but there certainly might be, and it's not due to the rash. It's actually due to the exposure, and the rash is a consequence of the exposure, but the exposure can also give rise to other long-term effects, such as cancer or asthma or kidney problems. It's very complex to link a particular exposure to a particular outcome. And that's why the COIDA system is not very good for getting compensation for that, because if you get an injury, you cut your hand, it's quite clear what the cause was. But if you get cancer, well, did you smoke? Was it something else? Was it hereditary? It's very hard to prove, and these cancers will take 10, 20 years to develop. So the COIDA schedule does not actually include a lot of long-term diseases. So then the onus becomes on the worker to prove that their cancer or whatever the outcome is was due to the exposure. And that is extremely difficult. So it's a system that's not really very fair for workers who expose over long periods. And that's the point. You have not just an exposure one day or a week, but over months, years, even decades. And that is a cumulative effect.
And just to stay with you, is this area around the usage of pesticides, is it regulated in any form or shape?
It is regulated, and it is a form or shape, but the Act is from 1947. So pre-apartheid, it is so old, it is a dinosaur. And that Act is meant to be repealed and revised. Every so often there's a new regulation that tinkers with it. But the control of pesticides under the Department of Agriculture is very weak. It's very much geared towards industry and production. Department of Labor has regulations for health and safety, which are not bad if you're a factory worker. If you're a worker and if you're unionized. But for farms, they are not very good, because basically, as you heard from Daniel earlier, the farmer simply refuses to do anything, and the Department of Labor is not there to compel them. So I think we have legislation which some of it is very bad, some of it which is okay, but it is not enforced. So protections for workers are very limited.
Well, I do understand we may have the Department of Labor with us in a little bit. We'll welcome them onto the program a bit later in the program. Dr. Leslie, of course, also will be leaving us very soon as we continue our conversation, certainly around COIDA and the ability to respond to some of these challenges. I want to, Daniel, just pick up on what Leslie had indicated there, that sometimes it's difficult, to get compensation or to get a recourse for exposures such as pesticides, because it's difficult to prove what is the long-term impact and what the correlation and causation would be of risk of exposure to disease that is then ended up being contracted at the later stage. Has there been a test of using COIDA to see whether it can respond to conditions such as these?
Unfortunately, not that we are aware of. But yeah, what Dr. Leslie is saying is absolutely true. It's very difficult to link the exposure to pesticides to a specific disease that has been developed over years because of the exposure over years.
And what then is the impact of that, Wendy? With there being no real connection that has been proven or could be proven, what happens to the victims that do share this exposure? Has this become their lives?
Yeah, can I maybe just say one thing is that we had two cases where there was exposure to pesticides. It was a man and a woman, two different areas, but both in Stellenbosch. And then with the woman, she had this her whole body had rashes on, and then she was swelling and lots of things, and they sprayed Roundup during that particular time because they remembered the name of the pesticides, went to the doctor knew the farmer. And because there's also relations and links and so forth. When we requested the blood results, because they did blood results, it came out as negative that there's no pesticides in the blood. But later in the workshop, I learned we must also look at what is the active ingredient in the pesticides. That's something that I didn't know about. And it's something that, of course, now for future cases, or we could have gotten but when she got to us, it was long after the incident, the accident has happened. And she went from doctor to doctor. She's permanently disabled, no compensation paid, because the test says that there was no pesticides in her blood. That becomes very difficult. If she would have come in the time of the accident, then a second opinion. from a whole different doctor. And also because that time the Industrial Health Research Council, they were still operating, and we were working very closely with them, and they were the experts in health and safety and occupational diseases and so forth. And it was a missed opportunity because she didn't know where to go and where to seek help. The other case, this guy he has asthma now, so he has a pump and he has everything. And he went to the doctors and medical doctors and all of that, and then he had to see a specialist. So they asked him whether he was smoking and all that history that Prof. Leslie was speaking about. And then when his results, when they didn't, before even the compensation commissioner was looking in, because we were forcing them to report it as an occupational disease. But then the specialist report says that that's not an injury on duty. Now, where does it leave him? I mean, if you permanently disabled, I mean, you will be compensated by the compensation fund. I mean, there would be your the medication, because you're going to need a lot of things, seeing the specialists, seeing the doctors, all of that. That stuff, then it means you will have to bear the cost as the worker, whereas that would have been the responsibility of the compensation fund to do so. And I think that's why the education is very important, to do education with workers and simplified pamphlets. We have a simplified pamphlet on it, and where we did a lot of trainings with 1,700 workers last year in partnership with the compensation fund.
Yeah.
Because it's not easy even for workers to report their cases. And I mean, there's further questions on the compensation fund and actual compensation to workers.
And I
mean,
want
that's
to get into that,
as well.
in our next segment, exactly how it works, the bureaucracy around it, the applications to receive benefits from it. I have the Labour Department standing by, and hopefully they will be able to respond to some of those as well. Professor Leslie, it sounds terribly concerning, the accounts there of Wendy, that, when there are real evidence of pesticide exposure and, this having been, an injury that was picked up at the work, why does COIDA seemingly not become an almost natural place of recourse? It seems that there are conditions to that.
So the case that Wendy describes is probably a case where the doctor either didn't know or didn't really want to pay a lot of attention about which pesticide to look for. And if the worker was exposed to glyphosate, you would not do a test for an organophosphate pesticide. The problem is it's quite difficult to get tests for glyphosate. It's very easy to get tests for organophosphate. So I suspect what happened is the worker was tested for the wrong pesticide, and that's why nothing was found. And that is a system which is not working. Department of Labour should recognize it. So if workers have exposures to certain chemicals, it should be the employer's obligation to make sure they are monitored and they are tested properly. And that actually is in the new regulation. In fact, it's in the old regulations that employers are obliged to do a risk assessment. And if workers are exposed to certain hazards, they have to have medical monitoring in place. And you should probably ask the Department of Labour, are they making sure that employers on farms do that? Because if they had done that here, they would have known you must test for glyphosate and not for something else. And perhaps the worker would have got compensation. The whole system needs a very careful overhaul, and part of the problem also is that health workers, professionals don't have good knowledge, and sometimes, as
and we'll put that to the Department of Labour very, very shortly. Prof, I know you have to leave us right now, so we thank you for participating in our program here this week as we take a look at COIDA and its impact potentially to mitigate against the type of diseases and injuries that farm workers may endure during their work time. We'll pick up on some of the other challenges once we do return from the break, as the Department of Labour is also set to join us. Do stay with us. We continue our series on COIDA, a piece of legislation that has in the recent times begun to become potentially impactful in the type of recourse that the most vulnerable of workers are exposed to. We spoke on previous occasion about the workers within the domestic working space, and this time around we're looking at the farm workers, those that work in agriculture in particular. And a big part of our program has been focusing on some of the risks. We've been, on previous occasions, spoke about transport, working materials, for instance, that are a bit of a challenge, as well as the tenure of stay for farm workers that live, on some of these farms. This time around, we're looking particularly at some of the other challenges. For instance, as we've been discussing, exposure to pesticides and whether or not COIDA is responsive, to such working conditions. I want to welcome from the Department of Labour at this time, Ms. Lerato Ramosabane, the Deputy Director for the Compensation Fund at the Department of Labour. Thank you, ma'am, very much for having joined us. I want to maybe just take a look at, in terms of your opening remarks, has COIDA been used, according to your knowledge, on previous occasion to respond to what has been described as a very widespread problem of poor working conditions that farm workers have to endure? So, according to your knowledge, is COIDA effective to this particular sector?
Good morning to you and the viewers. Thank you for having me this morning. With regard to the compensation fund, remember the main objective of the compensation fund is there to compensate for occupational injuries and occupational diseases that is contracted in course of the employee's employment. So in terms of the compensation fund, we do cover all sectors where there's employees involved.
But there has been,
Yes.
on this program, been described instances, for example, that pesticide exposure, and I'll come to whether or not the department is attentive to regulating the use of pesticides more closely. I'll come to that in a second, but it's been described that because there aren't sufficient mechanisms to diagnose pesticide exposure, and not just exposure, but once there has been exposure and rashes break out, people suffer from other particular diseases. From a clinical perspective, to make the connection here as an injury or a disease has been described as being pretty difficult. And so those farm workers that do, for instance, have a risk of exposure to pesticides are not being able to get the recourse that the compensation fund is able to provide. So has this come across your table, and why seemingly is this a challenge?
Okay. With regard to the compensation fund in terms of occupational disease, as compensation fund, what we are saying, all diseases need to be reported in a prescribed manner. What do we mean by that? Remember, in terms of occupational diseases, we must first have an exposure history that confirming, yes, indeed, that occupational disease, it was contracted through these pesticides as alleged. And what we need more as compensation fund, we need the risk assessment that was done in that farm. And also, we need the exposure history to determine for how long has this person been exposed to that environment. And we need as well the material data sheet for the pesticides that they are using. So when reporting this to the compensation fund, those are the factors that we are looking upon. But in terms of the risk assessment in the farms, that is, it falls within our other directorate, that is the inspection directorate. They are the ones who must go and conduct
just to be clear, the risk
but
assessment.
as compensation fund, we adjudicate upon claims that comes, adjudicate on claims that is reported in a prescribed manner. Like I've said, we've got schedules where all occupational diseases.
Okay, but just to be clear, the risk assessment, as you say, is done by the Department of Labour.
It must be reported to the compensation fund, then we'll make a decision, we'll adjudicate and say, yes, indeed, this is an occupational disease that is contracted in course of the employee's employment.
Okay, ma'am, I'm not sure whether you're not able to hear me, but what I want to understand is the risk assessment. You're confirming that that is done by the department. How regular are these assessments done, and how available are they?
In terms of the risk assessment, it's not done by the Department of Employment and Labor. Remember, the farm workers, they need to get an approved inspection authority, the AIA. So the Department of Employment and Labor, what we do, the inspectorate direction, they do conduct inspection annually to determine the risk associated to those pesticides, and if there are any control measures in place, like if they provide those employees with relevant personal protective equipment. So I'm not gonna speak much of the inspectorate directorate, because I'm much more on the compensation fund. Don't deal much with the risk assessment.
I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that. But part of the challenge, and I'm going to bring my other guests in perhaps just once we return from the break, I just want to get this foundational information from you. The challenges that they describe here is that, granted that this may not fall within your directorate, but the reality is that there have been cases cited on this program where there has been exposure, where the risk has been established, and the cause has now been clearly defined. Yet the farmer doesn't even take the worker to a hospital, and in certain circumstances where there has been a hospital appointment, it isn't enough for the compensation fund to say, here we go, you can then benefit from this particular fund. And so it then appears to me that while there is another directorate responsible for inspection, it directly links to the type of work that the compensation fund is meant to effect. And so is there not a disconnect here between the two different directorates in what is going to be to the benefit of the farm worker?
As the compensation fund, we are not 100% reliant on what we get from the risk assessment. We're saying if there's any alleged occupational injury or any alleged occupational diseases, the employee and the employer must report to the compensation funds such injuries and occupational disease. And then the compensation fund, we've got the occupational cluster whereby we'll adjudicate on such claims with the information at our disposal and make a decision whether we'll accept liability from the test, the lab test, or even the exposure history.
Okay.
We're not relying solely on the risk assessment only when we're adjudicating on occupational diseases.
Sure, but I'm following what you said to me, were the areas that you do look at, and risk assessment happens to be one of them. I want to come back, and once we return from the break, I want to deal with the issue around the reliance on the version of the employer as well. Because in this program, it's been highlighted that certain farm workers are not even being allowed to go to seek medical help, and in other scenarios we've been told that the employer doesn't even register the worker, and so therein lies perhaps a secondary challenge, which I'm going to have Wendy and Daniel pick up for us after the break. This is Workers' World. Do stay with us. All right, it's been a mixed bag of, I suppose, accounts of how COIDA works and whether it can be to the benefit particularly of a segment of workers that we're focusing on today, that are being farm workers. Wendy, I want to bring you in here very quickly. Of course, there were the Labour Department trying to understand the way to make workers achieve this benefit that is indeed their right. They're entitled to it. But as we've discussed on a previous edition focusing on COIDA, a significant part of the problem is reliant on the farmer, in this instance the employer, registering the worker, which in some instances do not happen. And in other instances, as you've described here today with us, that the farmer doesn't even want to allow the worker to seek medical help. How counterproductive would you say that is?
Yeah, can I maybe say that a lot of workers sometimes don't understand their rights with regards to occupational health and safety and also with regards to COIDA. And that is where we come in as organization to inform them and so that they can know what to do, how to, for the accident to be reported. So it can be reported to the compensation fund so the documents can be forwarded so they can be compensated. So a lot of that goes missing sometimes when farmers do not report it because workers do not know. And that is where we come in to report it or to make sure the Department of Labour know and do the inspections as well. But what we found is there are cases, and we have 2 current cases that we reported to the Cape Town office, where in both cases it's not pesticides related, but both workers are permanently disabled and the farmers have not it's a wine cellar in Stellenbosch and it's a farmer in Vredendal, very deep rural far in the West Coast. None of these cases has been reported. So inspections were done at both workplaces by the Department of Labour, and now we're waiting for reports to see what is happening. We're still within the 12-month period. But there are often cases where workers come to us after the 12-month period because for COIDA to claim, you must report it within the 12 months. Then it's never reported, and that is where there's problematic areas because the workers...
Whose responsibility is it, Wendy, to report it?
Within 7 days, the employer must report it through the compensation fund that there was an accident. Then there's a time period for them to submit the documentations. And as the medical reports come in, resumption reports, and a lot of reports will go to the compensation fund. But there's often times when farmers do not send these forms to the compensation fund, with the result that the workers never get compensation. We sit in cases in Ceres, and we also reported this to the Western Cape office. One farm, 6 injuries, 1 worker died in the workplace, but his wife got compensation for him. The children got compensation because they were all his dependents. But the 5 other workers, some of them lost limbs because they also have forestry on the farm. Limbs, some of their bodies are broken. And they've been waiting to hear from the compensation fund for a very long time. So what we did, we wrote to the compensation fund. We sent them all the ID numbers. Where we had the case numbers, we also sent it to the department. And they said, the compensation fund office said there was they went from an old system to a new system. And somehow, some of them were not added to the new system. We got news now that they added to the new system, but it's many, many years after. And I was just thinking if we maybe didn't inquire what would have happened to their cases. And there might be other cases that we don't know about. And we learned about these cases because we were training workers in many areas in partnership with the Compensation Fund in the Department of Labour last year. And that's how we came across the cases. And we decided that we're not training workers, giving them information and not do anything about it. We took the cases and we reported it, and now we are waiting feedback. But I learned that all the 5 workers were approved by the fund. I'm not sure what's going to happen next. I mean, we're waiting to see what is the next steps and so forth. But it will be great if Lerato can just tell us in terms of time periods. I know of David, who worked on a farm, Doornkral in Ceres. I mean, his injury was like over 10 years ago, and he hasn't received. He lost 2 of his fingers on the farm due to an accident, but he hasn't been compensated yet. So the time period in which people are waiting to be compensated, that takes very long. I'm not sure if the problem is between the farm and the doctor where the holdup is, but that's a bit challenging. Yeah, thank you.
All right, I'll ask Lerato to respond on the time frame question because 10 years seems like a terrible long time to verify things and to process things. So I'll come to that. I mean, that's 2 political administrations in South Africa. Daniel, your almost concluding remarks that I hope you will try and build into your thoughts around what the department can do differently to streamline the type of recourse that farm workers are able to receive from COIDA.
Thank you. I'm very glad to see Lerato here today. I haven't met her yet in person, but I've been inundated making submissions to her office with regards to claims that has been submitted, some as long as 2030. 11 years ago, a farm worker lost 3 fingers on a farm, and he only got his compensation 3 weeks ago due to pressure from our officers, phoning them each and every day, writing emails. So I'm totally on what Wendy is saying. In terms of time frames, there's no clear time frames. There's a clear time frame in terms of the amount of time you have to register these claims, but there's no clear time frame or regulations that tell the injured or the worker who has a disease when that person will be compensated. And that is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that workers had to wait 10 years to get compensated. It's a pity that the Department of Employment and Labour Inspectorate are not here today, because they are the missing link, because they are the people who does not inspect, they don't do investigations. I'm sure if we have to ask Lerato to give us numbers in terms of the annual inspections done by the Department Inspectorate, she wouldn't be able to give us that. There are no statistics. There's no coordination between the Compensation Commissioner and the Inspectorate of the Department. And one case in point was when we had to basically drag the OHS inspector to a farm in 2000 where a child lost her leg in Ceres when she was driving on a tractor whilst working. Now the department is using that matter as a statistic, but we had to basically drag them to lay criminal charges because, as Wendy was rightfully saying, employers have 7 days to register an injury and 14 days to register a disease. It doesn't happen. Does the department do anything about it? No, they don't lay criminal charges, even though the Act makes provision for it.
Yeah, and
So
I think that was
where
the point.
is the
That was the
justice
point
in
that
this
of
instance?
intervention that I was trying to make in our previous, segment. That clearly the inspectorate and the compensation fund needs to find ways to come together to find better synergy so that workers can get the resolve. And of course, then the other particular problematic area around getting the employer to report it when, if the employer has compromised working conditions, would he be incentivized to report it? Are natural questions that I think, complicates the benefit that workers can receive. All right, Lerato, we have a couple of seconds left. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot more time. I want to maybe just get your response to the time frame. 10, 11 years sounds pretty ridiculous.
Okay. Thank you for the question and the comment from the other presenters. It is true. Remember, with regard to the compensation fund, the background of the compensation fund, the services previously were centralized in Pretoria. The Western Cape only started with the decentralization of compensation fund from 2014. So in terms of the backlog, we know this backlog. The compensation fund is working hard to address those. But with regard to the current claims, we've got the time frame as the compensation fund. They are correct to say that the employers are expected to register claims within 7 days. As compensation fund as well, we are expected to adjudicate and pay compensation benefits to those claims within a stipulated time frame, of which is when we get the medical report. Remember, as compensation fund, we cannot say we will pay within 5 working days. We are dependent on medical reports from the medical services providers. Compensation fund is 3 stakeholders that play key role. in terms of compensating the employee. So we will solely be dependent on the medical report that is being submitted to us. And in terms of compensation, there are different compensation benefits, and the time frame in which we pay those benefits, it differs. I cannot say we will pay compensation benefit pension within a month. Unfortunately, remember, our compensation claim, it's open for a period of 2 years. Compensation fund can only pay when we receive the final medical report. It's then that we can pay the employee for the disablement sustained.
Sure. Ms. Lorato, I am so sorry to interject, but and I think it's such a crucial point that you're making, and I had so many follow-up questions to ask you, but we are out of time, and perhaps let's try and indulge us, please, at the later stage, for perhaps a follow-up program so that we can get a lot more detail so that workers can understand certainly the rights that is accorded to them and how they can benefit from it. We've been talking about COIDA, a piece of legislation that is able to respond to diseases and injuries that are caused within the workspace, looking at the most vulnerable sectors of the working class, how they can benefit from it, but also deal with the potholes that leads them to be able to benefit. We're trying to remedy some of that and more during the series of programs on COIDA that we'll bring for you here on Workers' World. With that being said, we have to wrap up. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.